Okay, so the major difference in this version is that we've got rid of the tubes. So we've got rid of the prefabs that were there, and that's because we can create them now. So when we click this button here, it instantiates the tube. The tube has a number, and the other thing is that we can move the tube. So we can drag it around, and that creates the space for another tube to be instantiated. And the other thing that we can do is put a volume in, and that will create a tube with that volume in. And of course, we can move the pipette to that tube, and we can suck up from it. And whilst the pipette is there, although we can move any other tube, we can't move the pipette in which the sorry, we can't move the tube in which the pipette is stuck. So that's all good. In order to release that, of course, we'd have to move the pipette, and then we can move the tube. So if we try and create a tube with a crazy volume, then it will just see what the maximum volume in the tube is and give us that. So that all looks quite good. And the way that we did that then is, first of all, to make a script that would instantiate the tube. And that script is triggered by this create button here. So one of the first things is to create a world space canvas, a canvas that's going to be on the over the entire screen, what some people call a heads-up display. And on that canvas, we've got a panel, which is this gray area here. And then on that panel, we've got three components: a title, which is just the word new tube, an input field where we're going to put the volume, and a button which is linked to the function that's going to actually instantiate the new tube. Now that script is held on an empty game object in the scene. And I mean, it could be on anything in the scene, but it seems to be general practice to create some sort of little controller empty game object that you plonk scripts on for that scene. So let's have a look at that script. The I've called it new tube, and of course, because it's going to instantiate a tube prefab, we need a reference to that prefab. We also need a reference to the input field that is where we're entering the volume, and we're also keeping track, a running tally of how many tubes that we've made, so we can update the tube number. And at the start, I've made it so that the tube number is 0. This may well be a redundant step because by definition it already starts at 0, but it's just a nice way of keeping your mind around it. So there's just this single function, create a tube. The very first thing we do is increment the number of the tube, and then we instantiate the tube prefab at a particular location. Now, of course, in future we might want to instantiate that tube at another location, but we just keep it at 000 for now. I name the tube. That's sort of happening off screen, if you like. If we just play this without maximizing it and we create the tube, then what you'll see is that T1 has been created here. And if I create another one, then I've got T2. So this numbering is going to be useful later on, or letter naming. Now, there are two things to bear in mind when you create the tube. First of all, have we put a volume in? So if we interrogate that input field for some sensible numbers, is there a sensible number there? If so, run the adjust volume function in the liquid portion. So it's almost like you're adding liquid, but make sure that that amount that you're adding is not over the capacity of the tube. So also go to the liquid in tube script, check what the capacity is, and if you've exceeded the capacity, then simply make the volume that you're putting in equal to the capacity. So this little section here is going to be the bit that decides on what volume is going in, ensures it's not going over the top, and then implements it just like it would if there was pipetting happening. And the final action is just to put the label or update the label so that tube number 1, tube number 2, tube number 3 end up with the right numbers on the front. So that's pretty good. The little modification was I've got this drag object script. And just to remind us of what that's doing, on the prefab, I've put a little cylinder at the bottom. I've switched the mesh renderer off, but let's put it back on so you can see it. There it is. There's this cylinder, which has got a collider on it, and that collider is basically going to act as the thing that enables us to grab this tube and move it around. So the script drag object is attached to this cylinder. This well, we don't display the mesh, but we keep the collider. And the drag object script looks like this. So it basically, when you put the mouse down, it first of all says, okay, the mouse is down on me, and I now need to make sure that any operation that occurs from now on is happening to the tube and not just to me as the collider, not just to me as that little cylinder at the bottom, but actually is now happening to the entire tube. Otherwise, all we'd do is move the cylinder around and not the tube. So when you put the mouse down, gather some data about the coordinates of items, and then when you drag, then move the whole tube by using those coordinates and information that you've gathered above. And the bits of things to gather are the offset of the mouse from the object that you're dragging. They're the Z coordinate of the thing that you're dragging, and of course at the moment we don't really have much Z in our scene. Everything's quite flat and two-dimensional, but that will come into play later on. And it's all about translating the mouse coordinates, the XY coordinates of the mouse, to the XYZ coordinates in world space, and then moving the item according to that. And the only rider on here is that we say if the pipette guide component of the tube is telling us that the tip is engaged, don't do this. So in other words, only if the tip isn't engaged should you start doing the movement. Now, the only other thing that I would point out is that when I had a lot of trouble when I was initially instantiating the tube with some errors being thrown. And I think that the best way of me talking about what was happening there is to have a look at the difference between the liquid in tube script before and after. So here's the liquid in tube script that we had before on the left hand side, and here it is afterwards. Now I've only made a couple of very subtle changes. The first two changes are to move these calculations of diameter and height, well, particularly the calculation of diameter, up to much earlier in the process. And the second thing is to actually, instead of defining these floats in the function, I've defined them up right at the start of the script. Now that may or may not be necessary, but it certainly helped my thought processes. And of course these items here are things, well, particularly cylinder diameter, that's something that's fixed when the tube is created. So there's not really any reason why it should be down in the function. it actually makes sense for it to be up front at the beginning of the process. But the really, really important thing was this change from start to awake. And I often find this, that when you're instantiating an object and running functions as you instantiate it, they don't work properly if you have them in start. Awake happens a lot earlier in the process, and it is often the case that you need to do things in awake rather than in start to get them to work. So this does work now with awake, but it was throwing all sorts of errors when I was trying to do it in when I had the things in start. So yeah, so that's where we are now. One of the things that I would point out is that we've actually got three different things on our tube now. We've got this drag object thing, which is located on the tube. We've got the pipette guide, which is attached to the tube. We've got the tube actions, which is attached to the tube. Um, we we've got so three different things are on the tube, and then within the tube we've got the liquid component as well. I'm starting to think that uh, with the things that are a property of the tube, they might all be better placed on the same script, but I'm not sure about that at the moment. We can look at that. The other thing that is slightly annoying me is the fact that I don't really like the fact that I've got to click this to open the lid, click this to move the pipette. I'm figuring that it might be better if those options were, those commands were actually located on the top of the pipette, so I didn't have these buttons appearing. But again, just a UI UX type thing. And I'm thinking that maybe now's about the time we should start talking about calculating some numbers, doing some moles, doing some concentration, uh, because we can sort those little um, movement things out and UI UX things later on. Okay, so that was a bit of progress made there, and we'll hopefully that's excited you about the next step.